5 minutes. That's how long it took me to notice the gleaming Mercedes SUV parked inside my garage. My garage. My studio. My sacred space. And no, it wasn't a dream or a hallucination from overworking. It was my neighbor Heather's car, the very picture of that suburban nightmare I never even knew existed until I moved into this condo. I'm a software developer, 28 years old, and I've been working remotely for almost 3 years. When I bought this house in the residential Vale Verde, the thing that attracted me the most was the chance to turn my spacious garage into a music production studio. Music has always been my passion, and finally, I had a space where I could create without worries. I invested in professional soundproofing, top-notch equipment, and turned that space into something really special. The first few months were perfect. I'd wake up early, work on my development tasks until the late afternoon, and then dedicate myself to music projects until late at night. The neighbors seemed chill and the condo had that calm feel you expect from high-end residential areas. The homeowners association had rules, of course, but nothing that bothered me until she showed up. Heather moved into the house next door with her husband Douglas about 6 months after me. She was around 45, with perfectly dyed hair and that kind of smile that never reaches her eyes. At our first encounter, she showed way too much interest in my daily routine, asking for details about my work and especially about that racket that sometimes came from my garage. "Yeah, it's my music studio," I explained politely. "But don't worry, I had it professionally soundproofed." "Interesting," she replied, smiling tensely. "Do you really know the rules our HOA has about running a business out of your home and noise levels? You should really read up on them. For your own good." And that was just the beginning. In less than a month, Heather not only knew all the condo rules but was already on the board of the association. And then the notification started. First, there were complaints about my musician friends who'd occasionally park improperly in front of my house. Next came gripes about the so-called noise from my studio, even though the soundproofing practically turned the garage into a sound bunker. I tried talking it over. I invited her to check out the studio and see the soundproofing for herself, but Heather refused, saying that the issue wasn't that but about following the rules to keep the neighborhood standards. Things got drastically worse one stormy afternoon. Hail the size of marbles was falling hard when I heard the doorbell. It was Heather, soaked and looking really anxious. "I need to park my car in your garage. I just bought it, and I can't leave it out in this hail." Before I could even answer, she was thrusting the Mercedes keys into my hand and running back to her house. I was in shock, but I decided to be a good neighbor. The next day, when I returned the car, I got nothing more than a nod of thanks. A week later, I found out that Heather had proposed and approved a new rule in the HOA, sharing parking in weather emergencies. Basically, neighbors could ask for shelter for their vehicles during storms. The problem was that only my house and 2 others had covered garages. The last straw came when I got back from a 3-day trip. When I opened my garage, I found her SUV parked among my musical equipment. No permission. No notice. "How did you get in here?" I asked when I confronted her. "I used the old code you left with the delivery folks last month," she replied as if it were perfectly normal. "There was a forecast for a storm and you weren't around. It's considered an emergency under the new rules." I took a deep breath and calmly explained that this was trespassing and her car could have damaged some very expensive equipment. "Don't be dramatic," she replied with a hint of disdain. "The rules about weather emergencies are clear." That same day, I changed the garage code and made it very clear, "Don't come onto my property without permission." She seemed to get the message. 2 days later, I came back from the supermarket and found my garage open again. Her Mercedes was there, parked among my equipment. This time, there were tire marks on cables and a synthesizer lying on the floor. That's when I made up my mind. If Heather wanted to play dirty, then I was going to show her who really knew the rules. I stood there, staring at the gleaming Mercedes among my equipment, the knocked-over synthesizer, and the tire marks on the cables. Something inside me just broke. It wasn't about being patient or keeping it civil anymore. It was about boundaries and respect. I grabbed my phone and called a friend who worked at a vehicle impound lot. "Raphael, I need a huge favor. Can you send a tow truck here right now?" In less than 40 minutes, the tow truck arrived quietly and towed the Mercedes to a secure lot. Even though I was furious, I'm not the kind of guy who'd go around damaging other people's property. The car would be safe, but Heather needed to learn a lesson about trespassing on someone else's turf. As soon as the truck turned the corner, my phone rang. It was her. "Connor, I'm coming to get my car." I had to dash because of a work emergency, Anne. "There's no car here, Heather." There was silence on the other end. Then, an incredulous voice said, "What do you mean?" "Exactly what you just heard. I found an abandoned car on my property and took care of it. Since it was in my garage without permission, I figured it was scrap and sold it for parts." "What did you just say?" Her scream was so loud I had to pull the phone away. "This is theft. It's a crime. I'm calling the police right now." "Go right ahead," I replied, surprising even myself with the calm in my voice. "Explain how you broke into my property twice, damaged my equipment, and why you thought you had any right to use my garage like your personal parking lot." I hung up before she could answer. I knew I only had a few minutes before everything went downhill. Exactly 12 minutes later, Heather was pounding on my door like she wanted to break it down. When I opened it, not only was she there but also Douglas, her husband, a tall guy with a very intimidating look. "Where's our car?" Douglas moved toward me. I kept my cool. "Breaking into private property now, Douglas? That's an interesting strategy." Heather jumped in, placing one hand on her husband's chest. "He claims you sold our Mercedes for scrap cause it was abandoned in your garage." Douglas looked confused. "What do you mean, Heather? Why was our car in his garage?" She looked visibly uncomfortable. I was just following the weather emergency rule we approved." "What weather emergency?" Douglas asked, looking up at a perfectly blue sky, not a cloud in sight. "And why didn't you park in our own garage?" Right then, I realized Douglas had no idea about the previous break-ins. The situation flipped as I explained it all, the first intrusion with the stolen code, my explicit warning, and then the second time with the damage to my equipment. "This can't be true," Douglas murmured, his face a mix of embarrassment and irritation. He turned to Heather. "Did you go onto his property without permission?" "You don't understand," Heather tried to justify herself. "The association has rules that allow." "They don't allow trespassing," I interrupted, showing him the footage from my security cameras on my phone. I had installed them after the first incident, a precaution that turned out to be vital. Douglas watched the video in silence, his face growing even sterner. "So, where's our car now?" "Safe," I said. "Not like my equipment when your wife turned my studio into your personal parking space." "I want my car back right now," Heather demanded, completely ignoring her husband and the evidence of her own misdeeds. "And I never wanted to see your car invading my property again," I shot back. "But here we are. I suggest we take this to the HOA board. I'm sure everyone will be interested in how a board member interprets these rules." Douglas sighed deeply. "Let's go, Heather. This isn't going to be solved like this." "Not without my car," she protested. "Now, Heather." His tone brooked no argument. As they walked away, I heard Douglas mutter, "Did you really break into his property? Twice? What were you thinking?" Less than an hour later, my phone rang again. It was Harold, the board president, a 67-year-old man whose voice always sounded like he was perpetually disappointed in something. "Connor, we got a serious complaint from Mrs. Heather. Something about you selling her car for scrap?" The disbelief in his voice was obvious. "Funny how she left out the part about breaking into my property twice, huh?" I replied. "We're going to need an emergency meeting to clear this up," Harold sighed. "Tomorrow, at 7 in the evening, in the community hall." I immediately called my friend Lucas, the lawyer. I explained the whole situation, and to my surprise, he actually laughed. Technically, you didn't steal anything. You just removed a vehicle that broke onto your property. The tow truck took it to a safe spot, right? Not for scrapping? Exactly, I confirmed. Well, it would be a crime if you actually sold the car. But you did what most people would do, remove an unauthorized vehicle from your property. I gotta say, that bluff was creative. I spent the rest of the night gathering evidence, the camera recordings, photos of the damage to my equipment, texts and call logs documenting my previous warnings. I also collected copies of earlier complaints Heather had made against me, showing her consistent pattern of harassment. The next evening, the community hall was packed. It seemed every resident in the condo had shown up, drawn by the drama spreading fast through the message groups. Harold opened the meeting with a serious expression. "We're here to discuss an unusual situation between two of our residents." Heather was the first to speak, launching into an emotional tirade about how I had stolen and sold her vehicles without any provocation, causing severe emotional damage, and how this showed I wasn't suitable for the community. "And what about the weather emergency rule?" she continued her tirade. "I was just following the guidelines we all approved." When it came to my turn, I calmly stood up and connected my laptop to the projector in the hall. First of all, I'd like to clarify that Mrs. Heather's car is perfectly intact and secure. I noticed her eyebrows shoot up in surprise. I never sold the car for scrap. That was something said in the heat of the moment after finding my property invaded for the second time. A murmur ran through the room. I then started presenting the evidence in order, first the hail incident, then the conveniently changed HOA rules, followed by the footage of the first break-in using the stolen code, my clear warning, and finally the second break-in that resulted in equipment damage. As you can see, I continued, showing close-ups of the damage. Professional audio equipment valued at over 15,000 reais was affected. This specific synthesizer is a nearly irreplaceable vintage model. When I showed the history of the baseless complaints Heather had lodged, other residents started telling their stories. "She also complained about my herb garden," exclaimed Mrs. Oliveira, a 70-year-old lady. "She said it ruined the neighborhood aesthetic, when it's actually completely within the landscaping guidelines. And she threatened to fine our family because our kids were playing with chalk on our own driveway," added Marcos, a dad to 6-year-old twins. Suddenly, it was as if a dam had burst. One by one, neighbors shared their own experiences with Heather, subtle threats, twisted takes on the rules, citations for minor infractions. The pattern was clear to everyone. Harold looked genuinely surprised. "Why didn't anyone bring these issues up before?" "Because she always goes on about how she's protecting the value of our properties and no one wants to be labeled a troublemaker," explained Patricia, who lived 3 houses down. "She always hints she knows real estate agents who could negatively affect future property values." I got back to the main point. As for the car, like I said, it's safe in a private lot. My intention was never to cause real harm, just to set a clear boundary after my civil attempts failed. Harold cleared his throat as he tried to process all the information. "Well, it looks like we have 2 issues here, the so-called weather emergency justifying your garage use and the method you chose to resolve the problem." "There was no weather emergency," Douglas interjected, surprising everyone since he hadn't spoken until now. "Heather lied to me too. She said that Connor had given her permission to use the garage. I never thought she was breaking into someone else's property." Heather's face flushed red. "Douglas, how can you?" "That's enough, Heather," he cut her off, his tone firm. "I saw the footage. I saw the messages. You crossed every possible line." The community hall fell completely silent after Douglas's statement. Heather looked like she had lost all her confidence, shrinking in her seat as her husband continued. "I want to apologize publicly to Connor and to all of you for my wife's behavior. I also want to make it clear that we will cover the damages to the studio equipment." He looked right at me. "And, of course, for the tow and storage costs for the vehicle." Harold cleared his throat again, adjusting his glasses. Well, given the evidence, I propose the following. First, the rule on sharing parking in weather emergencies should be revoked immediately. Second, we need to put safeguards in place so that rules can't be made for a board member's personal benefit. And third, he paused significantly, that Mrs. Heather be removed from her position on the board, and she should be barred from running for at least 3 years. The vote was almost unanimous. Only Heather voted against the proposal, while Douglas abstained, keeping his head down the entire time. I raised my hand to speak again. Considering how this turned out, I promised to return the vehicle tomorrow morning. The car was never really in danger, and I never meant to cause any financial harm, just set a clear boundary. After the meeting, I was surprised when several neighbors came over to thank me. Mrs. Oliveira even gave me a hug, her eyes a little teary. It's been 2 years of her bullying me over my herb garden. She said medicinal plants attract undesirables to the neighborhood. As if lavender and rosemary would attract criminals. Rodrigo, an architect who lived across the street, shook my hand enthusiastically. Man, she threatened to sue me because I painted my door a blue that wasn't on the approved palettes of the HOA. I had to repaint it 3 times until she finally approved. More and more stories kept coming out, making it clear that I wasn't the only target, just the first one to stand up to her. The next morning, as promised, I accompanied Douglas to the lot to retrieve the Mercedes. Along the way, he mostly stayed quiet, only occasionally commenting about the weather or the traffic. You know, he finally said as we waited for the release paperwork, Heather wasn't always like this. Something changed when we moved into the condo. The obsession with status, with appearances, with controlling everything around, it spiraled completely out of control. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. We're in couples therapy now, he continued. And she's also seeing a psychologist on her own. That's no excuse for what she's done, of course. I hope it helps, I replied honestly. Everyone deserves a second chance. Douglas smiled lightly. Maybe, but not here in Vale Verde. We're looking for another place to live. I think a fresh start would be better for everyone. 2 weeks later, the board called another meeting, this time to discuss policy reforms in the condo. The atmosphere was far lighter, with residents engaging in productive discussion for the first time in years. Harold, acting as president, looked almost rejuvenated. After all that's happened, we realized we need to review our policy so that the HOA really works for everyone, not as a tool for bullying. Among the new proposals were mandatory rotation of board members every 2 years, creating an independent review committee for complaints, and, what really surprised me, encouraging community cultural activities. We've discovered that there are so many talents here in the condo, Harold explained, looking right at me. From specialized gardeners to professional musicians. Instead of stifling creative expression, we should celebrate it, as long as everyone respects basic community norms. Patricia, who had been chosen for the board after Heather's exit, presented the boldest proposal of all, a small quarterly community festival where residents could share their passions and talents. Imagine, she said excitedly, a Sunday where Mrs. Oliveira hosts a workshop on medicinal herbs, where I can show a bit of my music production, and where we really come together as a community, not just a bunch of houses with rules. The idea was approved by everyone without even a formal vote. I left that meeting feeling almost surreal, as if we had finally woken up from a long period of collective oppression. The following month, Heather and Douglas' house was put up for sale, and in just 2 weeks a young family with 2 small kids closed the deal. At our first meeting, I casually mentioned my music studio. "That's amazing," exclaimed Julia, the new neighbor. "Our daughters are starting piano lessons. If it's not too much trouble, they'd love to see your studio sometime." The contrast with Heather's reception couldn't have been greater. The first community festival happened on a sunny spring Sunday. We set up colorful tents in the common area, each dedicated to a different activity. Mrs. Oliveira proudly displayed her herbs and offered fresh teas, Rodrigo organized a little exhibition of architectural models, and I put together a mini presentation using some of my studio equipment. To my surprise, several teenagers from the condo got interested in the music production process. Before long, I was explaining basic mixing concepts and showing them how to record different instrument layers to create a full song. "Do you give lessons?" asked Matthias, a 16-year-old who showed natural talent on the keyboards. "I never really thought about it," I replied honestly. "But why not?" By the end of the day, I had a list of 6 names of young people interested in learning music production, something that would never have happened in the old days, as some residents started calling the period under Heather's influence. The following months brought some big changes. With my studio finally being used to its full potential, I was able to finish my first self-produced EP. A few afternoons a week, I gave lessons to the young ones in the condo and discovered I had a passion for teaching that I never knew I had. Harold, now a close friend, popped over one Thursday afternoon with a bottle of wine. "To celebrate," he said, holding up the bottle. "I heard your EP, really impressive work." While we enjoyed the wine in my backyard, Harold reflected on the sequence of events that changed our community. "You know, as HOA president for 7 years, I thought I knew this place like the back of my hand. But I was completely out of touch with what was really going on. Heather manipulated the rules so much that we ended up creating a culture of fear instead of community. It's hard to see when it's happening gradually," I commented. "Exactly. Every small rule seemed reasonable on its own. Only when we looked at the whole picture did the abuse become clear." I raised my glass. "Here's to Vale Verde 2.0, then." "And to the car that never went to scrap," Harold added with a laugh. Even with all the positive changes, I kept a few precautions. I installed a more robust security system, meticulously documented every problematic interaction, and stored all of the evidence from the Mercedes case in a safe place, both digitally and on paper. Lucas, my lawyer friend, approved of my measures. "Always document everything," he advised. "I hope you never have to use it, but if you do, you'll be prepared." 6 months after the whole incident, I received an unexpected envelope. It was a letter from Heather, sent from an address in another city. I hesitated before opening it, worried it might contain some sort of late legal threat, but its content surprised me. "Connor, I'm writing to apologize for my behavior. Therapy has helped me recognize the destructive patterns I developed over the years. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just want you to know that I acknowledge the harm I caused you and others in the condo. Douglas and I are rebuilding our lives in a new place, and I'm working to be a better person. Heather." I didn't reply to the letter, but I kept it along with the other documents, a reminder that sometimes you have to stand up for your boundaries, even when it seems extreme. Looking back, the most valuable lesson I learned was about balance, between being patient and setting clear limits, between forgiving and documenting, between individuality and community. The whole car sold for scrap incident transformed not only my life but all of Vale Verde. Now, when I'm working in my studio and hear the kids laughing outside or see Mrs. Oliveira proudly showing her herb garden to visitors, I think about how sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air. And yes, I installed a new electronic lock system in the garage, with a code that changes automatically every 24 hours. Some lessons you only learn once.